Hi, welcome everyone to the next installment of the McGuire Woods Independent Sponsor webinar series. Today we are going to be discussing representation and warranty insurance in M&A transactions, otherwise known as RWI. While this is part of our Independent Sponsor webinar series, this will be helpful for really all private equity deal professionals, and we hope you learn a lot today. A quick housekeeping note, there is a function on this webinar to ask questions. Please feel free to shoot those to us as we walk through our presentation. We may not get a chance to answer all of the questions, but we'll keep track of them. And then one of the members of our team will reach out over the coming days to answer any questions that we're not able to address. So my name is Greg Hauver. I'm a partner in the Chicago office of McGuire Woods. My co-presenters today are Jeff Brooker, who is also a partner in our Dallas office. Jeff and I are deal lawyers. We focus on M&A transactions. We primarily represent buyers of companies, and so we are familiar with kind of all aspects of M&A transactions, including the use of rep and warranty insurance, which is becoming more and more common. We are lucky today to have our colleague Ann Dorsett in our Chicago office, in our Charlotte office, and Ann has a unique and very valuable practice in that she focuses primarily on helping us negotiate, place, and with any disputes relating to rep and warranty insurance. So she has a wealth of knowledge on the topics that we're going to cover today, and she is really a great value add and a differentiator for our McGuire Woods private equity team.
Yeah, I would say that you're not going to find someone in the country, I don't think, that understands rep and warranty insurance and how it works down all the way to the nitty-gritty nuances than Ann. So we bring her in most of our deals where we have rep and warranty insurance, so she sees a ton, and really, we're happy to have her here today and think she can lend some insights that are beyond even what Greg and I can do, and we are very familiar with this product. We use it all the time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. So before we dive into rep and warranty insurance, this product is usually characterized under the umbrella of transactional risk insurance, and transactional risk insurance is generally becoming more prominent in the industry, although out of the three types you see here, rep and warranty insurance remains by far the most popular. So the differences between these are that rep and warranty insurance is meant to address unknown issues that are covered by reps and warranties, which we'll discuss. Tax indemnity insurance and contingent liability insurance, on the other hand, are meant to cover known or highly probable liabilities. So you don't see these as often, but in the event that you are trying to reach a deal and there's a potential deal killer that neither the seller or the buyer is willing to really bear the risk of, you can explore these two products and see if you can bridge that gap. If you're going to use either of these, the insurer will come in and it will be, the legal team will get involved, and it will be a quantitative and qualitative analysis so they can really determine how to underwrite that specific risk. So it's sort of a whole other subset of this product, but wanted to make you aware of it. With that, I will leave it to Ann to discuss the rise of rep and warranty insurance in the M&A world.
Great. Thanks, Greg, and welcome, everybody. As this chart reflects, you can see the exponential growth of the use of RWI, particularly from the end of 2015 on. I first got involved with this on a sell-side product in 2009, and I learned last year it was one of 40 policies issued that year, 40 R&W policies issued that year. In 2018, it's projected that more than 3,000 policies were issued. And so one of the questions is, what is driving this increase in the use of the product? It started out as a sell-side product, but is now firmly entrenched as a buy-side product. It's primarily driven by private equity sellers who look to see a quick and clean exit following a sale. What RWI provides is shorter escrow periods, lower escrow fund amounts, and in many cases, a growing number of cases, no escrow at all from the seller. And in addition to those benefits, the sellers also benefited by a reduction of any contingent liability, enabling a quicker distribution of sale funds. It attracts the best bids, and it protects passive sellers. So what is the benefit to buyers? Well, the buyers get an increased indemnity period. As we'll talk more later on, you're going to get 6 years for fundamental and tax reps and 3 years for non-fundamental reps. It provides recourse where no seller recourse is available, kind of like a strategic deal, distinguishes your bid in an auction, and it protects key relationships. And this is really a differentiating factor about RWI, particularly if you're bringing in seller into your new company. You want to avoid getting into a dispute with the seller over a breach of a rep. Instead, you go to the insurer for that. And it also provides a credit-worthy source of recovery. R&W insurers, by and large, have an A-plus credit rating, so it's a good source of recovery. And the last thing that's driving this is the growth of the RWI market. In 2009, only one insurer was providing this, AIG, then known as Chartis. Now more than 20 insurers are providing the market, and that competition is going to drive your costs down. We've seen premium costs almost halve, going from 4% to somewhere around 2.5%, depending on the size of your deal. We're also seeing RWI open up to small deals. So we're placing a policy now for a $6 million deal that is completely new. You're going to see higher requirements in terms of the coverage that you're required, but that's a big, big break. They're also expanding target coverage into healthcare, hospice, energy, real estate heavy deals, and financial services deals, areas where the market had not been present before. And any comments from Jeff or Greg before I go on to the next slide?
Yeah, I would just note, to your last point, Anne, don't assume if you're a buyer that this deal is too small to place rep and warranty insurance, or that it's in an industry that won't be covered, just because, as Anne mentioned, it's really expanding into different areas. You'll have different terms, and they may not be as great as kind of the standard package, but it's worth exploring with an insurance broker. So with that, before we dive too deep into the details, I just wanted to compare and contrast what I'll call a, quote, traditional deal versus a deal that uses RWI, or a rep and warranty deal, as we call them in shorthand. Jeff and I gave a webinar about 2 months ago where we walked through in detail the indemnification package for a traditional private M&A transaction in the middle market. So feel free to refer back to that. But I'll just cover at a very high level, the difference between the two constructs is that in the traditional deal, the seller makes representations and warranties in the purchase agreement, which are statements about the target company and its historical operations. To the extent that those are not accurate in a traditional deal, the seller pays. It is subject to some caps and some deductibles with respect to the buyer taking the first portion of that potentially, but basically the seller pays. In an RWI deal, we're interjecting a third party in here, and so the seller is still making the representations and warranties and providing the disclosure about them, but subject to some retentions. As you'll see on the graph on the right, the policy steps in and takes a significant amount of the exposure. So, and just a note, there is a glitch on this slide. The buyer's cap is typically 0.5%, and that's typically a deductible of the enterprise value. And then the seller's piece of the retention on the right is typically 0.5%. And we'll go into more detail on that later. So again, at a high level, one, the seller's always paying, or the buyer, and in an RWI deal, you're interjecting the insurer And so the other pieces of this are that the other nuance here is on the right-hand side with respect to the size of the policy, it can be 9 or 10% up to maybe 20%, whatever amount of coverage you want to purchase. And there is typically a 1% tranche of that the insurer will ask, that will be called the retention. And so the typical approach is to divide that up 50-50, whereas the buyer takes the first 0.5%, the seller takes the next 0.5%. A growing trend is that the buyer would take the whole 1% of that retention before the policy, and that we call that a no indemnity deal. And Ann can speak about how that's becoming more common, but in any event, this is the general construct, and you'll see just by comparing simply the two green areas why a seller likes the RWI approach and why in a competitive auction they're going to push for the RWI approach. Not only do they have a limited exposure of 0.5% on general reps, this affects how much they're taking away at the closing. In the traditional deal on the left, they're leaving about 10% usually in a third-party escrow, so they don't see that for 12 to 18 months, whereas in an RWI deal, they're going to really just be leaving behind about 0.5%.
Right.
So unless, yeah, Ann?
And the other thing I was going to say, for smaller deals, you're going to see a higher percentage of the RWI. So for the $6 million deal that I talked about, the minimum policy that they were willing to issue was $3 million. So that's 50% of the risk. And that's just the price of doing business. At some point, it's going to get too small that the premiums that they receive for it won't be worth doing it. So just note, as the deal gets smaller, you might see a higher amount of required limits, but that really only comes into play when you're getting below $12 million.
Great. Jeff, you want to go into some of the key economic terms?
Sure. Yep. So moving on to the next slide. Okay, great. So there's a few different costs associated with this product. Obviously, the insurers are not going to be doing this for free. So the first is the coverage limits. And so this is just, how much is the buyer willing to buy? And what we're seeing is buyers are mostly buying about 10 to 20% of the enterprise value as coverage. But that is, there's no requirement that it be any particular percentage. But it will cost you, as the next bullet says, 2.5 to 4% of the coverage limit is what the premium cost will be. And so that is regardless of whether there's ever a claim down the road, just to get the policy into place, the initial upfront premium is 2.5 to 4%. And in a larger deal, it's going to be over $100 million enterprise value deal, you're probably going to fall toward the bottom of that range. And in a smaller deal, you're going to fall more toward the top of that range. And then there's the retention that Greg talked about. That is that works like the deductible kind of on your auto insurance, where somebody runs into your car and then you have to eat the first $500, let's say, before Geico steps in and they are going to pay the remainder of the claim. So that is like the retention. And as Greg said, that's usually 1% of enterprise value, and dropping down after the first year to 0.5%. And the way that the market has typically done that is when we are splitting that 1% 50-50 between the buyer and the seller, when that after 12 months, when the retention steps down, typically that's the seller's 50% that goes away, and the buyer still retains their 0.5% retention, and will still be eating that 0.5% of the retention before they are able to make a claim. And then the last piece of the economic pie here is the underwriting fee, typically about $30,000 to $50,000, and that is prior to even placing the policy. The rep and warranty insurer is going to want to do diligence on your deal. They're going to want to ask a lot of questions, read the documents, make sure that this is a deal that they are able to underwrite and responsibly commit to paying out on. And so typically they'll hire a team of lawyers, whether that be in-house or we're seeing it's very common that a lot of these insurers hire outside counsel from big firms. And so this underwriting fee effectively pays for those costs. And so in order to get the insurer to start that diligence process, they will expect the buyer, typically in a buy-side policy, to write that check, and it becomes non-refundable once it's written. So that way, if it turns out that your deal has a whole lot of problems in it and coverage turns out to have so many exclusions that it doesn't really make sense, you still don't get that underwriting fee back. And so, whether you're a private equity fund with committed capital or whether you are an independent sponsor, you still want to be pretty judicious about when you pull the trigger to write that check. You want to be sure that you have enough deal certainty at that point that you are comfortable writing that non-refundable check. So if your Q of E is not back yet, it's probably premature. If you've got some really big deal issues that you need to work through that could kill the deal, you probably want to work through those first and then write the check and get the rep and warranty insurer started. And you can, and we'll talk a little bit more about process there, but there are some things that you can do to push process along so that you've identified what the policies would look like from a high level, but you really don't know about exclusions and whatnot without that insurer digging in, and none of that's going to happen until that underwriting fee is paid. A couple other points here that aren't really covered on the bullets. So duration of the policy, you're buying 10 to 20% typically of the enterprise value. And the duration for ordinary reps, you're generally getting 3 years of coverage under these policies. In a non-rep and warranty insurance deal, the market had been for seller to be liable. The survival of the ordinary reps was a 12 to 18 months was the playing field for market. And so you are getting a longer coverage period. And then for fundamental reps, it's typically 6 years. And we had, in a non-rep and warranty insurance deal, we had typically done fundamental reps as either indefinite or statute of limitations, based on statute of limitations. So that actually, and a lot of those statute of limitations are even shorter than 6 years. So you're getting a nice coverage period as far as survival on these policies. And so from that perspective, it provides a really solid survival of claim period here. So Ann and Greg, any comments before we move on to the next slide?
The only comment I would add is that tax reps, whether or not they're fundamental, receive 6 years, as do pre-closing tax indemnities.
Great. Good point. So just want to run through kind of what this looks like in practice, taking into account Jeff's points about economic terms and just running through how we see this play out. So for this illustrative example, we're going to assume a $50 million purchase price, and we find that $50 million tends to be the sweet spot as far as when the quote market terms kick in for rep and warranty insurance, if not a little bit below that, but also, when an auction process will be very competitive such that the seller will likely dictate that all of the participants use a rep and warranty product. And I think we've emphasized it before, but in many, many cases, it's not so much a decision of whether to use the rep and warranty insurance product or not. It is, for better or worse, just getting conversant with it, because the auction process will basically dictate that you're going to be using it. So just running through this example, you'll see on the left that the same allocation of risk here, but with some numbers on it. You'll see that at a $50 million deal, you'd be able to generally purchase about $5 million of insurance coverage for about $150,000. That's 3% of the policy coverage. Ann would say that the market may be closer to 2.4 to 2.6% at a $50 million enterprise value. But in any case, it's not a large amount for the amount of coverage you'll see. As Jeff mentioned, 3 to 6 years for rep survival. And so this will be the general construct that you'll see in many of these deals. And just a process point. So in the auction process, once you make it past the first or second stage and you get to the LOI phase, you typically won't have squared away everything with respect to your RWI policy. So you'll want to draft the letter of intent so that it contemplates that you will bind rep and warranty coverage. And so when you talk about the indemnification provisions of the purchase agreement, it should clearly contemplate that. But you should leave yourself as buyer some wiggle room, stating that if there are specific diligence issues that pop up and they're excluded from coverage under the policy, you would want indemnity for those from the seller, specific $1 indemnity. And you'd also want to say the LOI that you're going to use reasonable efforts to obtain RWI coverage, but you never know, that there may be an issue with obtaining it, or there may be too many exclusions or too expensive. So you want to leave a little bit of wiggle room. And Jeff or Ann, any comments on the process generally, or should Ann just kind of dive into the timeline?
Well, since you mentioned the LOI is also a good place to determine who is going to bear which costs. So traditionally, it was a 50-50 split between the buyer and seller in paying premiums and the underwriting fee. I have seen that is now changing, just as seller indemnity is going away. Seller responsibility for the policy is also going away. A lot of it just depends on your negotiation strength as to the amount of the premiums and underwriting fee that's shared. There's also a surplus line tax. I typically recommend that that's not shared, just because for taxes it's just easier for one party to pay and have that in their books. And then certain brokers will charge a fee. I don't think it's appropriate to charge a seller for the fee if you're using a larger broker that does charge a fee. But turning to the process, so back in the day when the policies were not issued to more challenging targets, I would be able to assure clients that it was a 2-week process from selecting the insurer to getting a policy underwritten. Now with part of it's due to the busyness of underwriters, part of it is due to the complexity of targets. I think 3 weeks is more reasonable and more realistic. We can do it. I just did a deal where we had the underwriting call on Thursday and we closed today. It was a fun weekend. So I really recommend to clients to look more to a 2-week period. So let's talk about the process. So the bid process begins. You will select a broker, and if your broker is not familiar with RWI, I strongly recommend that you have the broker reach out to a wholesale broker with experience in that, or that you select an experienced broker different from your current broker. And the reason why is these are very different types of policies. They are not like your standard commercial policies. A lot of the underwriting and a lot of the broker interaction, just like any deal, takes place at 11 o'clock. And a lot of brokers who don't do RWI are not familiar with not taking lunches on the day of closing, and responding to emails at 11 o'clock. And also just the breadth of knowledge that they bring is worth switching brokers if your broker is not experienced. So once you've picked your broker, you get the broker to sign an NDA, and you provide an NDA for any insurers whom the broker will reach out to. Also included in that package is your desired indemnity structure. So if you want to receive several bids, so let's say you want to bid for 10% EV, 12% EV, and 15% EV, you would include that in the information your broker would reach out with. You also want to include, if you have a fundamental rep that is not traditionally a fundamental rep, such as a healthcare, labor, employment, IT, you want to include that information early on so that the insurers know what they're bidding for. Also, you want to provide a draft purchase agreement. I prefer to provide buyer's version, but you can provide seller's version, the offering memorandum and SIM, and just as an FYI, there is absolutely no cost at this point when you're reaching out to the market to get bids. So hopefully then you get the bids from the insurers. And I will say that if for EVs at 10 million or less, if you see 2 bids, you're lucky. It is still a growing market, and my experience is you're going to get 1 or 2 bids. But for larger bids, larger EVs, you should get 3 or 4, depending on the target. And once you get that bid, you want to look at certain key things. Obviously pricing, and the pricing will vary, but it doesn't vary that much. So your focus should really be on the deal-specific exclusions that the insurer is going to tell you right off the bat, I'm not covering AR, or I'm not going to cover environmental. And so you weigh that in your selection process. You also will see special treatment of purchase agreement terms. Those are super important, and it's important to have your deal team attorney help you look at the bids to determine whether those are tipping points. You'll see areas of heightened concern. That's really not as important in terms of selecting an insurer, because basically all of the insurers are going to be looking at all of the issues, even if they don't list them. And then lastly, underwriting fee. Jeff talked about that. The higher the underwriting fee, the more engaged counsel will be, including running the underwriting call. So my preference is always to go with an insurer who has a lower underwriting fee. So once you get past that, once you've selected your insurer, you're going to start the underwriting process. And your consultants, including your lawyers, will send a non-reliance letter off, and you'll start exchanging the reports. In order to have the call, you need to provide the following: quality of earnings report, any tax reports and other financial reports, legal due diligence, and if applicable, any environmental reports, stage 1, stage 2s, any billing and coding reports. Again, that's very target specific. You also need to provide deal documents that are in good shape. So that would be the purchase agreement, buyer's turn of the purchase agreement, and buyer's turn of the schedules. And once you've provided that...
Can I jump in on the QOV? I've had a couple of deals lately that QOV was done early, and then for whatever reason the deal lagged and the QOV became stale, and we had to do a bring down of some of those reports. So that can become an issue if any of this gets stale.
Right, and if you're relying, because I know some of the smaller deals, they're going to rely on the seller's QOV. That is another piece of the puzzle that you need to tell your broker about when you're reaching out to the market. Because some insurers will accept a seller's QOV if you've done some financial review of it yourself. Same thing if you're just doing a red flag memo, that should be part of the information that you provide your broker reaching out to the market. For smaller deals, they'll accept a red flag memo. For larger deals, they're less inclined to do so. So 24 hours after you've provided all of that information, you'll have an underwriting call, which will last about 2 hours, and it's where the underwriter and his or her counsel get to ask questions. You'll receive an agenda with questions depending on the insurer. Some of it can be very detailed, some of it can be very general. If you get a detailed agenda, be happy, because while it seems daunting, those calls tend to go a lot faster than the calls that have more general agendas. And once you have the underwriting call, about 24 hours after that, will receive the policy, any exclusions that have arisen from the underwriting call, and follow-up questions. And that's where the negotiation period begins. So you're going to be responding to follow-up questions on any open items in diligence. So if you're presenting a diligence report that has a ton of open items, a lot of your follow-up questions will be confirm that you have received all of the consents for the leases, confirm this, confirm that. Some of that, if you're unable to do so before closing, some can be made conditional exclusions if you feel like you're going to resolve them immediately after closing. Once you resolve those open items to the satisfaction of the insurer, they'll pull that exclusion off. In addition, this product is very different from your commercial policies, your other commercial policies. There is a lot more wiggle room, particularly for deal-specific exclusions in terms of negotiation. So I work hard with the deal team to figure out ways to eliminate or restrict exclusions, and that's also what takes that 2 to 5 day period. It just depends a lot on the diligence that was done and how complete the diligence was. So as I said, whether it's going to be a 2-week or 3-week process really depends on the status of your deal documents, the depth of your diligence, and the ability to negotiate with sellers, including having them actually respond to follow-up questions. And that's another point that I recommend including in the LOI is a requirement that seller cooperate with you during the underwriting process. And then also negotiating special indemnities for known exclusions where there's no way you can work around an exclusion that has come up during an underwriting call. Do you guys have any comments from your experience being on underwriting calls?
Yeah, one quick point on negotiation, and Ann didn't spend too much time on it because she spends a lot of her time fighting specific exclusions with the deal team, but one great component of Ann's practice is that she does a deep dive and negotiates the form of the policies as well. Each insurer has their own form of policy, and not only has the latest state of the art as far as what is the market doing on the different definitions, but also has basically negotiated policies with every major carrier such that when we get their form of policy, it's usually the one that McGuire Woods has already negotiated. So I'll quickly brag about Ann for a moment there, but that is part of the negotiation process.
Yeah, that's a huge value add and something the deal lawyers love because those are not short or easy to read documents. So somebody who does it well and knows it well is awesome to have on the team.
So let's talk about due diligence. It is a misconception that some buyers new to the process think that by using RWI you get to decrease your diligence. That is actually not true. First of all, you're only getting 10% of the deal covered by insurance. So you've got 90% that you're looking at. And more, there is even less, traditionally sellers would be on the hook for fundamentals. I'm seeing more and more no indemnity provisions whatsoever. So it is important to do due diligence even if you have RWI. The heightened risk areas, once you look through those, you need to know that the diligence that you perform on those areas needs to be deep and specific. We've already talked about the Q of E. Areas that they really focus on are items that are not in compliance with GAAP. You need to have your tax people be able to discuss those and talk about the amount of risk. If it's a low risk, low dollar amount, you won't see an exclusion, but if it's a high risk, high dollar amount, you will. FLSA is a huge item that they look at. Misclassified employees will be excluded, and our goal when that happens is to try to keep that list as small as possible. I always recommend that you schedule known issues, and if a clear exclusion is coming up, that you try to get a special indemnity rather than respond to a question that you know will just lead to an exclusion. And the reason for that is we get to control the pen that way. We get to say we get to schedule the exception to the rep as narrowly as possible. Likewise, with a specific indemnity, we get to classify that specific indemnity as narrow as possible. If we simply respond in a way that's going to lead to an exclusion, insurers being insurers will come up with a very broad exclusion, and so we're going to have to negotiate that down. So it's just better to control the PIN, whether you can do it through a schedule or specific indemnity. The buyer is better off taking that approach. Any other comments about diligence from Jeff or Greg?
No, I would just highlight that, once specific known items come up, that's the time to huddle up with your lawyers, because those are really outside the spirit of what the rep and warranty policy will cover. And so, as Ann mentioned, you need to be very strategic on a lot of levels with respect to those. Okay, so I'm going to – go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly cover some key terms in the purchase agreement. So a purchase agreement that you use in a traditional deal versus a purchase agreement you use in a rep and warranty deal are not fundamentally different. They look, for the most part, the same, but there are some key provisions that you and your lawyer need to focus on and make sure sync up with what's going on in the policy. So quickly covering a couple of these. On survival of reps, the key takeaway is that the policy is going to govern. It's going to be 3 years for general, 6 years for fundamental and tax, and the insurer doesn't really care what the purchase agreement is going to say, and there's different approaches to drafting the purchase agreement, other than fraud, claims for fraud by the seller. The insurer will want to make sure that the purchase agreement never has any time limitations on a claim for seller's fraud, because that's one area where if it occurs, the insurer will be able to go against the seller for their fraud. On caps, we already talked about the retention amounts, and so in your purchase agreement, your caps of 0.5% or 1%, those are going to sync up with the retention that we talked about. The interesting question here is, what do you do with respect to fundamental reps? So in a traditional deal, a fundamental rep is something that goes to something like the ownership of the shares that you're buying. And the market approach in a traditional deal is that the seller is liable up to the purchase price if there's an issue with something that's quote, fundamental. So the issue is, in a competitive process, what happens if there's a breach of a fundamental rep and it goes over and above your 10% or 20% insurance policy? And we usually see, and I think it's just a function of negotiating power and the auction process, that buyers, when buyers utilize rep and warranty insurance, they're willing to take on any overage over the rep and warranty policy, even for fundamental reps. It isn't always the case, but that's relatively common, and I chalk it up primarily to competitive dynamics. A couple other quick ones. The materiality scrape, we don't need to go into great detail on this, but a scrape benefits a buyer. It says that the word material throughout reps and warranties is going to be disregarded or scraped. And so the takeaway here is that if you as a buyer are able to negotiate for that in the purchase agreement, then the insurer will similarly honor that in their policy and with respect to the losses they're willing to cover. A somewhat related point is the definition of losses in your purchase agreement. In a traditional deal, there's a lot of fighting about what is a loss that's subject to indemnity. Sellers really hate being on the hook for losses relating to consequential damages, indirect damages, and multiples of damages to the extent the purchase price is based on EBITDA or something of that nature. So the upshot here for rep and warranty deals is that if you're able to go silent on those in the purchase agreement vis-a-vis the seller, then the rep and warranty provider will similarly be silent in the policy. And the result of that is that you as a buyer kind of get to save for another day the fight as far as what are recoverable damages as opposed to excluding them at the outset. And finally, exclusions from coverage. Ann talked about how there are specific deal-by-deal exclusions. There are also just general topics that are excluded from coverage. the most notable of which is the actual knowledge of the buyer's deal team, which Jeff will discuss in the next slide. There's just general exclusions for forward-looking statements in reps and warranties. So the reps and warranties are meant to talk about the current status of a company or maybe its historical operations, not something that's forward-looking, such as accounts receivable will be collected at a 100% rate following the closing. An insurer will think you're trying to shoehorn something into coverage that's not meant to be covered. So those are a couple of the key terms. And Jeff and Ann, unless there are questions, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just jump in. So another point that is worth making about the definition of losses, as deals become more seller-friendly, sellers will often push for a very restrictive definition of losses, and you need to be careful about that because the policy does follow that. So you either assure the seller that there's no indemnity by virtue of a very short survival period, which, as Jeff said, the insurer will ignore, or you need to work with the insurer to synthetically provide a better definition of loss within the policy. Because what you don't want to get caught up with is a purchase agreement that specifically says losses do not include multiples, and then when you go to make a claim, you're shoehorned by that definition, and the insurer will not allow you to make a loss based on multiples. And then with respect to seller indemnity for fundamentals above the rep and warranty, as Greg said, more and more we are seeing this kind of no seller indemnity. In my experience, it's not quite hit the 50% mark, but it is a growing trend. And you just deal with, if you're able to negotiate for seller indemnity above and beyond the rep and warranty policy, that's addressed in your indemnity waterfall, where you'll work in the escrow, the rep and warranty, and then the seller indemnity.
Yeah, I think the bigger and the more competitive a deal is, the more likely it's going to be no seller indemnity. So,
yeah.
If you're in the $50 million range, I don't think that's become it's certainly not ubiquitous at that point. More often than not at that size, I see there be seller indemnity for fundamentals, but I know it all depends on competitive dynamics and how sexy is the target, et cetera, for determining leverage and how some of these points play out. So moving on to the next slide then, some of the getting a little bit, I guess, further in the weeds on some of these purchase agreement points. So the knowledge of buyer's deal team is going to be an exclusion under the policy. The rationale there being that this is an insurance product to insure unknown risks. It is not a product for the insurer to step in and pay things that we know about today. And so that's different than if we were in a deal without rep and warranty insurance, where we tell the sellers typically that the reps have to speak for themselves. It doesn't matter what we know, and we're not going to argue about after the fact what we knew and how does it affect the reps. The insurers tell us, well, no, that's not the way we're willing to do business. To the extent that the buyer's deal team had actual knowledge, and there's no constructive knowledge standard, no duty of inquiry, just simply if we knew about it, it's carved out. And then the insurer has the burden of proving that knowledge. So the burden of proof is on them, which is helpful for us, but it can blow a hole into your coverage a bit, so that if you do know about things, as Ann had mentioned before, thinking ahead and trying to flag those things and making them specific indemnities, that's probably the preferred approach here, because what you don't want is to think you're covered and forget about this knowledge point, and after the fact the insurer points out that it was in the memo or in the diligence that this was clearly a liability that we're going to have to exclude from coverage. Subrogation is another point. So subrogation is the idea that if your insurance pays up on something, the insurance can then go after the party that was responsible for the loss. Similar to like in your car insurance, if someone hits your car insurance pays you $10,000 to fix it, and then they go after the person who hit you for the $10,000. Here, that wouldn't be that helpful if the rep and warranty insurance provider were to pay out to the buyer, but then go chase the seller for subrogation and sue them for the claim, because that way the seller doesn't avoid, part of the whole point of this is to minimize risk to the seller. And so that subrogation is limited to just fraud. It's seller's fraud. And so if seller hasn't committed any fraud, then the insurer will not be able to go after them and sue them. But if there is fraud, then it's fair for the insurer to go after them, and they will. Another point here, when we're separating out sign and close, it can get a little bit complicated, and there's a few additional things we need to think about. The policy is typically bound at the signing, and there will typically be at signing a 10% non-refundable deposit. So if deal breaks between sign and close, you're going to be out that 10%. But then the remainder is due at the closing. When you're wiring the money and your funds flow, that remaining 90% is paid. One of the other points when you're separating out sign and close is similar to the way that because of knowledge of the deal team is excluded, the insurer is not paying for known liabilities. They're just insuring against things that we don't know about. If something comes up between sign and close, if something occurs and the buyer becomes aware of it, that will become an exclusion from the policy. That the insurers will not pay for that. And so what that practically means is that if one of those things happens, it's going to be a breach of a rep, and the buyer is going to have to stand up and say, look, the closing condition that the reps are true is not met. We've got this issue that's excluded from the policy, and we have to do an amendment to the purchase agreement to discuss how we're going to handle that risk. Or they can close over it if it's de minimis, but if it's something material, that's likely the way that's going to play out. When there's rollover equity, if the rollover is large enough, then this starts to look more like a JV to the insurer rather than an acquisition, and there will start to be discussions about whether the seller's knowledge, not just the buyer's knowledge, is going to be an exclusion, and that around 25% or so of the post-closing cap table is when you may start having that discussion. And as it gets larger and larger, the rollover gets larger and larger, that it becomes more and more difficult to push back against the insurer's push to include seller knowledge. Obviously, if you include seller knowledge, that they've been running the company for years, and to the extent that there's something they know about that gets, that starts to blow a pretty big hole into your coverage potentially. And then the other point here is because we are pushing most of the risk here to the insurer, the buyer is typically able to get much broader, more buyer-friendly reps than the buyer would be able to get if the seller had more skin in the game and their lawyers had more incentive to negotiate these reps very hard, because when it's on the seller's dime, he's going to care a lot more. And we're able to leverage that a lot here. The folks know that when they're representing sell-side clients, that because we're going to be pushing that risk to the insurer, we expect really strong buyer reps. So there's a cost in terms of the economics that we talked about a few slides ago, but there is also a benefit here that you do get typically stronger reps. So Ann or Greg, anything to add before we jump to the next slide?
I have a couple of things. For rollover, if it's a group of individuals, such as a doc practice or partners, even if you have like 25% rollover, if the individuals own less than 10%, we're often able to get the insurer to treat it as if it was not a high rollover deal. And then with respect to broad buyer-friendly reps, this is where you're going to start to see carve-outs in the definition of breach or the definition of loss. So your diligence has to match the broad buyer-friendly reps, or the insurer will, on behalf of the seller, because it is acting as if it was the seller, insert knowledge qualifiers and things that it expects to see based on the diligence. Greg? Okay, so we'll go to claims. So one of the difficulties that I have in terms of advising clients about claims is the fact that most of these policies have an arbitration provision, which means that they are never litigated, and there's there's one or two cases, but very little case law. And because it's arbitrated, these are all private. So all we can do is rely on the reports by the insurers and our own experience and the experience of our brokers. Only one insurer, AIG, provides any kind of consistent and valuable data about claims. And so you'll see in the slide, these are the types of reps that are being breached. One important thing, this is based on claims made between 2011 and 2016. The 2018 study that AIG published, for the first time, financial statements were not the number one type of claim. Instead, we see compliance with laws, and I believe that's just a reflection of the market agreeing to go into more heavily regulated targets. Per AIG's report, 1 in 5 policies results in a claim. The largest deals, those in excess of $1 billion, see 24%, or nearly one in 4. And also have the highest claims being paid out. For deals below 100 million, 17% are seeing claims, but that group also represents 40% of all policies sold. So a ton more policies. I don't think you're going to see on policies below 100 million the same level of claims. While it's 17%, it's 17% of a much bigger pool. With respect to making claims, a lot of it depends on the type of claim presented. So as you would likely expect, third-party claims, such as a breach of contract, an allegation of unfair trade, a trademark infringement, are much easier to quantify in terms of the loss that a buyer will suffer. You have a settlement that you've arrived at. It's finite. It's not going to you. It's going to somebody else. So those are easier for the insurer to wrap their hands around with respect to the amount that they owe. But of course, the first thing you need is a breach of a rep. So a lawsuit filed against the seller company after the acquisition is not necessarily covered. What's covered is if you can show the seller knew about it and did not schedule it. So you've got to show that a breach occurred and that the losses that you've suffered arise out of that breach. So that's where we get into the problem with first-party claims, usually claims arising out of a breach of a financial statement or a breach of a tax rep. And the problem with that is if you're relying on multiples to prove your damages, it just starts to get a lot trickier. And when you're in that position, you're going to need to retain a forensic accountant to assist you in the valuation. The insurer will also retain a forensic accountant to assist it in its evaluation. And you can anticipate in those types of claims that the claim period will be 12 months or more. Whereas with a third-party claim, in my experience, it's been about 3 months. Again, it's simply because the damages are much easier to review and assess versus a valuation claim. And so we will go to our last slide, our final observations. So as I said, as you've heard throughout, due diligence is really important. rep and warranty insurance is not a replacement for due diligence, and if you go skinny on diligence, you will likely see exclusions. This is not to say that a company has to outsource all of its diligence. A lot of times, if a company is well suited, if the target matches its same platform and the company wants to do the diligence internally, that's fine. Those people just need to be on the underwriting call and need to address the questions that the underwriter raises. As you've heard most previously, insurers are going to vigorously fight claims. Insurers like to take your premiums. They do not like to pay out on claims. I will note, however, that because this is not mandatory insurance, most insurers are very cognizant of the impact of the failure to pay claims on this product, which makes a lot of money for them. And most insurers are much more commercial when it comes to claims versus your standard P&C insurers.
Great. And my key takeaway for this audience is just to really understand the ins and outs of the rep and warranty insurance product. As you think about it from the outset, the competitive dynamics in an auction or whatever process you're in may dictate that you need to use the products, but understand, exactly what are the scope of the exclusions, how do those erode coverage, understand what level of insurance do I want to buy, is it 10%, 15%, what's the price of the coverage, and just in discussing with your lawyers and with your deal team, just understand how it impacts the overall risk allocation. I think it's a feature of the M&A world that's not going to go anytime soon, and so understanding it's the key.
Yeah, and we did get a couple of questions here. I'm looking through a couple of questions about the split in costs and who pays. I would say in most deals today, sellers tend to have a lot of leverage. There's so much capital chasing deals that in a good deal, I would expect that the buyer would end up paying the premium and the underwriting fee for most deals, and then the retention. If you're in an auction setting, the retention is likely to be paid by buyer as well. If it's slightly less competitive, then it's pretty common to see 50-50, where the buyer and the seller would split those costs 50-50. But I'm not seeing a ton of deals where the seller is agreeing to pay split the premium or the underwriting fee. I think that would be more if you've got a deal that's got some hair on it and maybe is having some trouble attracting suitors, or for whatever reason that the seller doesn't have a lot of leverage. Maybe they've gone through a broken process, and they're just not super attractive to a buyer right now. So that, I think, answers a handful of questions that we've had. But we will try to get back to, we've got a number of questions here, and we'll try to get back to folks who have written in an answer, or a question, sorry. And I suppose this has been the hour, so I want to thank everyone who did sign in and listen. Happy to provide the slides if folks are interested in that, and we are available, all three of us. If you want to email us or give us a call with any additional questions, we're happy to help you in any way we can. And so with that, we'll end the broadcast. And like I said, reach out to us at our we're all on the website. Reach out to us if you've got questions. We're happy to help.
Thanks very much.